This video tutorial will look at factoring 2 and 3 term polynomials by finding the greatest common factor and using the distributive property. Let's factor the binomial 5x plus 20. Remember, the first step when factoring any polynomial is to determine if it has a greatest common factor. To do so, we must look at each of the terms in the polynomial to see what they have in common. The greatest common factor of 5x and 20 is 5. So 5 becomes our first factor. You see the parentheses because now we're going to determine what the second factor of 5x plus 20 is. To do this, we basically have to do the distributive property in reverse. So we are going to ask the question 5 times what is going to be 5x. We know that 5 times x is 5x. Next, we have to determine 5 times what equals positive 20. This would be positive 4 because 5 times positive 4 equals positive 20. So factoring 5x plus 20, we get the factors 5 and x plus 4. Let's double check this to make sure our factors are correct. 5 times x is 5x, and 5 times positive 4 is positive 20. So it checks out. So when we factor 5x plus 20, our factors are 5 and x plus 4. So this would be our answer, 5 times x plus 4. Let's try another example. Let's factor 3xy squared minus 10x squared y. Let's start by finding the greatest common factor. So we're going to determine the greatest common factor between these two terms. This would be xy, so this becomes our first factor. Now we are going to use the distributive property in reverse to find our second factor. We need to ask ourselves what xy needs to be multiplied by to get 3xy squared. This would be 3y. Next, we need to ask ourselves what xy needs to be multiplied by to get negative 10x squared y. This would be negative 10x. So, when we factor 3xy squared minus 10x squared y, our factors are xy and 3y minus 10x. Let's double check just to make sure. Xy times 3y is 3xy squared, and xy times negative 10x is negative 10x squared y. So our factors check out. So when factoring this polynomial, our factors are xy and 3y minus 10x. Let's try another example. This time, we will have a trinomial, a 3-term polynomial. This is in contrast to our two previous examples where we had binomials, 2-term polynomials. We will follow the same process and first determine the greatest common factor of the polynomial. So we need to look at the 3 terms in the polynomial. The greatest common factor would be 5, so this becomes our first factor. Now, once again, we will use the distributive property in reverse to determine our second factor. We know that 5 times x to the third y squared would be 5x to the third y squared. 5 times negative 2xy would be negative 10xy. And 5 times positive 4 would be positive 20. So when we factor this polynomial, our factors are 5 and x to the third y squared minus 2xy plus 4. Let's look at one final example. Let's factor 4x squared y squared z minus 10x squared y squared plus 2xy. Again, we need to find the greatest common factor. So we will look at the 3 terms and determine the greatest common factor amongst the 3 of them. The greatest common factor would be 2xy. We will now use the distributive property in reverse to determine the second factor. 2xy times 2xyz would be 4x squared y squared z. 2xy times negative 5xy would be negative 10x squared y squared. And 2xy times positive 1 would be positive 2xy. So factoring this polynomial, we get the 2 factors, 2xy and 2xyz minus 5xy plus 1. Looking back at the 4 answers from this video tutorial, we can reflect that everything in red was the first step that we did. We determined the greatest common factor first, and that became our first factor. Then we used the distributive property in reverse to come up with the second factor, which is in black.